the connection between education and exclusion has to do with the idea that in many developing countries, probably most developing countries, education systems are designed to exclude most young people as you move up the ladder. So the focus of the MDG is to get everybody into primary school in grade 1. Over time, many of these children normally drop out. When you get to the end of primary school, a certain percentage, maybe 50%, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, are going to end up graduating or sitting for your national exams. And then based on that, you move into secondary school. Now, secondary school is the great cutoff between primary and secondary. Secondary often is the place where it signifies that you've moved up in class. Secondary education is where in a lot of countries, once you receive even 1 year of secondary school, you're considered an intellectual. You can't farm. It's inappropriate for you to farm after that. It would be really embarrassing in many places, particularly in Africa in my experience. And then you move up from there to secondary school. The thing is, it's kind of like a triangle. MDGs focus on getting everybody into primary school, and they've been remarkably successful. Governments with supportive donors. That's been a great achievement. And then moving up into getting graduation, you know, things are getting better for graduation from primary school. But the big thing is that systems are set up so that very few people go into secondary school. In Rwanda, it's between 5 and 10%. In Burundi, I think it's about 15%. And those kinds of averages aren't that surprising in these these fragile states. So getting into university is usually 1 or 2% of people, of youth, of the university age. So secondary school age students is where the great cutoff begins. And that's the idea that where exclusion is structured into societies. And to talk about marginalized youth, almost by definition, 80–90% of all youth are marginalized because in their view, they can't go to secondary school. They're stuck being farmers or with having low horizons for where they can advance. And that's how that issue is connected. That's the framework for how young people and their parents look at these issues. This is a huge problem, sexual violence, and the reason is that I think there's a sense that if you get girls into school, that you're going to increase their chances for getting real protection. That school is a right; they should be in school. There are many reasons why parents want them in school or don't want them in school. In terms of after wars in places where there are bride prices, school, it not only helps your daughter, but it increases the bride price. So the more school she gets, the more you're going to get. Now, that is not a small thing because after a war, your investments, are ruined. Your house is ruined. You have to rebuild your farmland if you're in the rural area. In the city, you don't have any capital. How are you going to restart your business? Things like that. So bride price can be a really big deal. You're really depending on that. You need daughters to marry to bring in that bride price. So in those kinds of situations, you want to be able to. There's a motivation to get girls in school that it's not just about education. So what do? Well, the protection issues start from getting a girl from her house to school and back. That's a place where sexual molestation, abuse, rape can take place. And during a war, after a war, the frequency of sexual violence can really explode. So this is a very dangerous period every day, every school day in the life of a small girl. In school, there are big threats from teachers who sexually molest or rape girl students, and that's really quite common. So you can't really address these issues to protect these girls, to get them into school, unless you understand the context. And another issue is, what if they're pregnant? What if they become mothers? It's very common in fragile states, very common during and after wars. How are you going to deal with childcare? How are you going to deal with the issue of humiliation, an embarrassment about being pregnant without being married, about being a mother and without being married? So, you know, these are contextual. You need to figure this out in the country context, in the local context, to figure out what those answers is. And usually women's leaders are very savvy at understanding this. And when I mean women's leaders, I'm not talking about people, you know, sitting in the capitals necessarily. People in those communities, women, but also quite often men. I mean, they have daughters, will have some real good ideas for you. And those are, I think, the ways that you can start to find answers to protect girls and make sure that they have a chance to go to school. Well, the big issue here is that donors and governments and their donor supporters, partners, are way behind on this issue. When a war happens, quite often the place you don't want to be is in a rural area. When there is fragility in a state in terms of the economy, the one thing you don't want to do is farm. You're really exposed as a farmer. And not only that, because of neoliberal economic policies, you need money if you're in the countryside. You have to take your oldest son, usually. Quite increasingly, it's also daughters. But you say, you know, you boy, you're not going to school. You know, you got your 3 years of primary school. Get to the city, make some money, and bring it back here. Or send it back. When you get enough, come back and give it to us, because you need cash. Life is very expensive in war and post-war environments, and cash is the thing that's very hard to come by, particularly in rural areas. So the focus for young people, by necessity, and the drive is to get into cities. And the big weakness of looking at of governments and their donor partners in general, and implementing partners, is that generally speaking, they focus on rural areas. And there's a feeling that I have never seen proved, that if you invest in rural areas, people will go back from the cities to the rural areas. Usually doesn't happen. You go back and visit perhaps, but once you get a foothold in the city, you can't leave, because your family back in the rural areas needs that money. And there's no cash to be found usually in the rural areas. So cities matter, cities are important, and these youth that are in the cities are extremely enterprising, and they have a different view on life. Young people have a strong sense of morality. And in the city, it's right in front of you. Well, you know, if the police are robbing you or selling drugs or wanting a cut, you know, extortion, people talk a lot about the corruption of officials, the corruption of the government, then what's the difference about how you make a living? If you sell drugs yourself, what difference does it make? The cops are doing it. You see what I mean? That's the kind of idea or philosophy that can really bubble up. Now, when you're focused on getting indicators, you know, to prove your investments are working, cities are the hardest place to work. Lives are complicated. It's challenging. And you know, everybody is on a learning curve to work with marginalized youth in cities. But that's the future, and that's where we need to be. Well, the issue about masculinity and in looking at education issues in fragile states, in wars, in countries that are afflicted by war or coming out of war, is a crucial issue. And I think that governments and donor agencies are very late to the game to think about the impact of demography. It's very difficult these days. It's virtually impossible in many of these countries to find, for most young boys, adolescent boys, male youth, to become men, according to the traditional way. You're supposed to have land and build a house. Well, where's the land? Where's the money so that you can build a house? So the real threat here is failed masculinity, is being a failed man. And unfortunately, traditional definitions of womanhood depend on manhood. In other words, a female youth can't become a woman in many societies until she has somebody to marry. And if a male youth doesn't have any financial stability and can't build a house first, for example, in many societies, then she's stuck. She can't, how can she become a woman? Now, there are those who argue that there have to be new ways to becoming men and to becoming women. Well, it's already happening. But these are identities that are quite diminished, and mostly they take place in cities. And one of the things that happens in cities is that you don't feel so embarrassed about not becoming a man, because everybody's like that. Everybody around you is struggling to be a man, not quite going to make it. Struggling to be a woman, not quite going to make it. So there are these new identities, but they are really of a diminished nature. It's a grave weakness in our approach to these issues to identify gender primarily with adolescent girls and women, and to view male youth as a security issue more than a gender issue or a development issue. This really undercuts the holistic way that people live in terms of gender. Men live with women, women live with men, you have brothers, sisters, wives have fathers, they have husbands, they have sons. So you're surrounded by these other gender issues. And so these issues of failed masculinity is a real big threat, because failed men can really be destabilizing if they're humiliated by society. And one of the things, it seems to me, that donors need to do and international agencies need to do is to think about is how do we start that conversation? In other words, how come we can't talk about this issue that there's so many people, young people in your society, and they're having so much trouble becoming adults? Do people want it that way in the society? No. We need to start having conversations about this. And I think that that's one of the roles that international agencies, international partners can start to work with governments about, is to say, look, nobody wants this, all this threat of failed adulthood. What do we do about it? So the difference between the urban education experience as compared to the rural education experience can be really different. I think governments, international agencies have a kind of a bucolic idea of what education is and what a school is. And normally what that looks like in a lot of developing countries is in a rural area. It's in a village. I was a headmaster a long time ago. You have your classrooms and you have school assembly and children are in uniforms and they sing songs and they learn and they walk home together and do their homework and come back to school the next day and so forth. So that's our ideal in rural areas. In other words, the ideal is a rural-based ideal. There's nothing wrong with that. The challenges are what's going on in the everyday lives of the students and their families or their households. Now, a lot of youth, one of the big challenges in these situations is, in war and post-war situations in particular, is that you've got a lot of orphans. Now, quite often, if you're an orphan boy, you have to assume, and the definition of an orphan often is that your father's dead. So your job is to start, this would be in Burundi, this would be in South Sudan, for example. Your job is to support your mother and to support your brothers and sisters. Now, if you don't take into account this issue, many of these orphans, the boys and the girls, particularly the older siblings, whose job it is to support the younger siblings and often their mother, they can't go to school. and they can't stay in school because they've got to work. So how do we deal with these issues? Adolescent girls in these fragile states in war, post-war situations quite often get pregnant. How are we going to deal with that? Now, the context in a city and a rural area can be quite different, and these can be quite specific with regards to what needs to be done to get kids in school so that their ability to support their parents or the household is not compromised while they're learning. There are issues of, how many hours of the day, which hours of the day. This is extremely important in urban areas, because if you don't have money, you can't eat, much less pay your rent. So how do you figure out how to get marginalized kids that really need school and really want to be in there? How do you do that without compromising their ability to make a living so that they can, stay reasonably stable in a city? Because it's all about money. If you don't have money, you're stuck. You're on the streets, and you're hungry, and you fall into prostitution and thieving to survive. So you have to start thinking in a different way if you really want to take this MDG idea and expand it for out-of-school youth, to expand it to children who are in cities, as well as to understand what's really going on in rural areas. You have to start thinking in a different way. You have to start really learning before you make decisions, and you can't make assumptions about this. These local realities are what it's all about.